Let me show you how to show the futures and options trading income in your income tax return, as well as which ITR form is to be chosen in case you have futures and options income. So here are the details of the futures and options transactions entered into by the taxpayer. In our given example, the taxpayer has entered into 4 futures and options transactions during the financial year 24-25. In the first transaction, the sales amount is 96,400 and the purchase amount is 81,100. Now let's see the first step that we need to do to calculate the details in respect of futures and options. The first step involves calculating the net profit or loss for the futures and options transactions. In the first transaction, the sales amount is 96,400 and the purchase amount is 81,100. And thus, the profit in case of the first transaction is rupees 15,300. Likewise, in case of second transaction, the profit is of rupees 30,180. In case of third transaction, it's a loss of rupees 8,175. And in case of the fourth transaction, the loss is 7,235. Now, the sum total of the profit or loss incurred in respect of these futures and options transactions is rupees 30,070. And thus, the answer to step 1 would be 30,070 rupees. Now, the next step involves calculation of turnover from the futures and options transactions. Now, in respect of futures and options transactions, the turnover would be calculated for each of the transactions individually. And the turnover for each transaction would be the absolute value of the profit or loss earned in that transaction. Now, what does this mean? Let's understand this with the help of our example. In case of the first transaction, the profit that is earned is rupees 15,300. And thus, the turnover for the first transaction would be the absolute value of the profit earned, which means the turnover for the first transaction would be 15,300 only. Likewise, in case of second transaction, the turnover for the second transaction would be 30,180 only. Now, in case of third transaction, here again, the turnover would be the absolute value of the loss that was incurred. This means the turnover for the third transaction would be 8,175. This means we'll be simply ignoring the negative sign. In the same way, for the fourth transaction, the turnover would be 7,235. Here again, we ignore the negative sign. And thus, the turnover for futures and options would be rupees 60,890. Accordingly, the answer to step 2 would be 60,890. Now, the big question would be, which ITR form is to be chosen in case of futures and options transactions? Now, as per the Income Tax Act, all the transactions entered into with respect to futures and options trading in equity shares, such transactions would always be treated as a business income. And thus, all the transactions from futures and options in equity shares would be treated as normal business income or loss. This means the ITR that we should choose in case of futures and options would be ITR 3. Yes, you heard that right. In case of futures and options transactions, you will always have to choose ITR 3. So this is how you calculate the details in respect of futures and options.